recordings from last week didn't catch. But if you look in here under, under resources now, inside class recordings, inside fall, we do have the two from last week, right? The 16th and the 18th. So these recordings are already in place, and we'll go ahead and post the recording for today as soon as we finish the class. So if you missed anything, that would be good to check out. Now, when it comes to this assignment here, I said, or I should have said last week, that you'd have an easier time of, so this is just a review opportunity. I shared with you last week that it would be easier and quicker to complete some of the tasks for this assignment, in particular the updates, if you accessed what feature of your personal computer? Does anyone recall?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
So last week I shared that that if you access a certain feature and perform some steps first, that this part of the assignment would be much quicker and easier to complete.
I believe you mentioned doing a disk cleanup. I don't know if this was this class or if it was another class, but I do remember you saying about doing a disk cleanup, disk defragmenter, also like going through your software applications and making sure that there's nothing there that you don't know about, just ensuring that everything that's there is something that you actively use or is supposed to be there.
In case I am confused, this is something I'd like to refresh the trail on here. Thank you, Milan. Yes, that was the intended tip. If you go into Control Panel and look at Programs and Features, there are many older and unused applications. And the simple truth is those older and unused applications, some of them will require the installation of older operating system components. And this will slow down your updates because those also have to be updated when you run Windows updates. So you'd want to uninstall those things first. The other thing you want to do is use the apps in settings, because you can have some apps. Here's a great example. I don't think I called this out last week, but this is a hash tool that I use in some of my cyber courses. It is also of value in our course if you want to know that a data file has not changed. This is installed kind of like the App Store on portable technology. It doesn't appear in this list, right? So you're not going to see any hash tool listed here in my programs and features. But it's important to look on your start menu to see if there's anything you don't really use or need. And the way to do that is to go into settings and then go into apps, and then to look through the list. And if there's something in there that you don't know about and you don't need, take it out. Now, I did also mention about antivirus, did I not? Did I mention?
Yes, you did.
Yeah, the free antivirus is a particular challenge because trial versions of the antivirus, they want you to pay a subscription after the trial period is over, and people tend to leave it in place, and you get these little blinkies in the lower right corner that say, hey, don't you wanna update, pay for the subscription? It's very, very, we have a deal going, it's lower in cost. They want to, and everybody ignores it. The problem is that it doesn't update or improve as threats change, because it was a trial version and there's a false sense of security. You're much better off using the system security that's built in. It's called Windows Defender, and the virus and threat protection that's built into your operating system is now much more effective than in general than open source. Or now there's going to be a lot of people that debate that point because everybody likes free. But this is designed to integrate with the kernel of your operating system in ways that free stuff doesn't. So the important thing is to remember, if you have multiple different types of antivirus, the only one you need is the one that's included in Windows. Okay. Now, if you weed your garden and do that first, and then as you capture the CPU and memory capacity, does anyone recall what option I used to get this view of things?
Task manager?
Yes, Task Manager, thank you. So you right click and go into Task Manager, and then click on the Performance tab and select CPU, and that way I can see what kind of processor you have and how much memory. You want to close a lot of applications and tabs in your browser before you do that. And you'll find that I'm about to, now we did talk about the article summary as well, yes? Kind of, sort of, maybe.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you did.
Okay, so each of you belong to a STEM major, science, technology, engineering, or math major. And the intent here is to find something about your discipline that's really cool, in particular about scientific computing, that might be of interest. I would say if you're stuck, a good place to start, and this is cutting edge, how many of you know you can use a video card to create a supercomputer? Are all of you aware that that's possible?
No, I wasn't aware.
Okay, so you can, it's called OpenGL, right? And you can use graphics, and I'm just gonna, we'll search for this, right? So you don't need to buy the formal expansion cards, but you can basically take NVIDIA graphics cards, and then with the right kind of software, you can work some high performance computing, HPC, or if you have multiples of these and you stitch them together, one incarnation of this is called SLI. AMD processors, GPUs, and NVIDIA processors both can do this. And one flavor of working tandem graphics cards together for high performance or supercomputing is called SLI. And this is one topic that's really fascinating. The stuff that they use for gaming controllers, gaming graphics cards, in a CUDA programming environment, basically you can work the efficiency of those processors because they're ideally suited for floating point calculations that are so necessary for simulations. And that's an important thing we're going to visit in our class later when we get to the module on simulations and supercomputing. Okay. So that's something that would be worth having a look at. we're going to post an assignment for you to download the resource. And in particular, the virtual machine. So the solution for the virtual machine is actually a link. And I'm going to show you the link for this. I dug this out. And oh, where is that? And in here. Yep, this is it. So this particular link is actually a Dropbox link. It's provided by the publisher. So MIT has a separate website, and it takes a good while to dig it out. But essentially, I'll put this link and it'll say for solution of module 1, click this link, and that's going to launch the download directly. Now, here's the fun part. Can everybody see how large this thing is? Let's go in here and take a look at it. I want to see this full screen. There we go. All right. So I'm sitting at the university campus. I'm using the Wi-Fi, and I'm getting about 2.5 megabytes per second. And at this point, I've got like 150 megabytes by the time I finish this sentence of a 9.5 gigabyte download. That's pretty beefy.
Could you make it a torrent?
I could try. That's not a bad question, but I will be on the St. Thomas campus in a few days, and I will bring a thumb drive with this in case you can't download it yourself. The important point is that I've already downloaded it. That's why you see the 1 here. And I'm going to cancel this download and go in here to my downloads because I want you to see this. I did mention that we needed you to create a temp folder on the C drive, yes or no? Does that sound familiar? Yes, no, maybe? We did.
Probably in another class.
Well, we did talk in this class about changing your view options.
Yeah, I believe we did.
Yep, I think we did too in this class. We wanted you to be able to see specific things about your file system, and in particular, you would need a temp directory, and that's just handy to have. It's kind of an extra workspace. So if you select your C drive and you don't have a temp, you can use the right mouse button and then create a new folder called temp. And why do you want to do that? Well, when you download zip files, large zip files, they have to be unpacked. And in Windows, that's a pretty simple process. In a Mac, it's pretty simple. And what you want to do is double click this thing, and then you want to select it, and you want to copy it, and then you can paste it into your temp folder. Now, that's very important because it's the uncompressed file that actually does the magic. And an OVA file is a virtual appliance. So it's an install object. That's where the O comes from, I think. And then Well, it's install media, right? And it's a virtual appliance, which means that everything is configured, pre-configured for you. You don't have to set up a virtual machine. It's ready to go. And I'm going to take the time in the first part of our class today to demonstrate how to use that OVA to create a virtual machine. Now, why is this so important to finish? Why is this so important to finish before we get to the solution and the setup of the virtual machine? Well, the available disk space is absolutely critical. When you import the OVA, it's going to expand and create a virtual hard disk that's about 20 gigabytes large. If you do not have 20 gigs, I'm going to talk to you before you start working the process, right? So if I see that you don't have 20 gigs and plenty to spare, I'm going to be sending you an email and say, hey, we need to do some things to create some room on your system. And that may be as simple as, pick up an external hard drive or a thumb drive from Office Max or SuperDollar, right? They have thumb drives, and transfer some of your movies and music and whatever over to the thumb drive, right? And then delete it once it's on your thumb drive or external hard drive, and then empty your recycle bin. Now, if you don't empty your recycle bin, you're not going to actually clear out any hard drive space. That's one thing about Macs and PCs. If you delete something, it's not deleted for a time, and you don't really have that disk space. And so the trick is to verify that you have that copy, that you can delete it. Okay. So this is percolating along. And I'm going to show you something that I want you to note in this recording. I downloaded this from the Dropbox, and it is a legitimate, authentic download from the publisher. And one of the things that we can do to check your download to make sure it's complete and there's file integrity is to simply open the thing in your downloads folder. So in my downloads folder, I have this, and I'm going to right click it with my right mouse button and then pull up properties. You should see the exact same size. Now there's two sizes, size on disk and size of the file, right? So sometimes you get minor differences between a compressed size in transit versus something on a disk after it unpacked, right? So what's the size of the file? If your download does not match to the exact byte, if it doesn't end in 308, if it's not 10, comma 238, comma 605, 308 bytes, then your download is corrupt or it didn't work right. Now your difference, you may get a different result with a Mac, because the Mac file system, there are minor differences between the way that a Mac file system and a Windows compute size. But the important thing is here. Now, once again, this will be part of your assignment, and I'll include this information and say, be sure to check that your download size, not size on disk, but size, is 10,238,605,308 bytes. And if it isn't, you probably don't have a good copy. Now, what about what we just copied into the temp folder? Inside my temp folder, I now have an OVA file I can use to build my machine. Now, obviously, if I'm cramped for space, look, I've just lost some space here, right? How do I gain that back? Well, one of the ways I gain that back is I verify that I have a proper extracted file, an OVA file. And to do that, again, is I call this a checksum. You're checking the sum of the byte count. And that's an oversimplification, but that's what I'd like to call it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull up properties for this. And you'll notice that the size is different. 10,410,870,272 bytes. Okay. That's a proper file size. So one thing I'm going to do with this temp file is build that. But in order to make some room, I'm going to go ahead and take my zip file. After I've done this and I've verified that count, I'm going to delete it. But that's not going to help me gain size until I empty what? Please? Anyone?
In your recycling bin.
My recycling bin. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure we're all there. Any questions at this point? Now, in my list, does anyone here see Oracle or see VirtualBox?
Yes. 6.1.34.
Right here. But what's the date on that thing?
March 21st.
2022. Yeah. Now the odds are pretty good that if I don't have the latest, greatest VirtualBox and I don't have the latest, greatest version of Windows 10, so I go into System, and this is another thing I think we covered last week. You go into About, and you're gonna see this build number. If I don't have the latest build, then there are bugs and instabilities that haven't been patched and fixed, right? Oracle, I could start Oracle, but I'm going to choose instead to uninstall this because if it's not the latest version, it's going to ask me if I'm sure I want to do this. Because it was from April, the odds are pretty good that I have a new version. It's not 6.1.34 is the latest version. The reason that's important is that as my OS builds change, my VirtualBox builds also have to change, right?
Couldn't you update it in the actual software?
You can. That's a great question, and thank you for asking that. If you were to run Oracle, there's a default setting you can enable that will check for updates every time you start it. The only problem with that is I've discovered that half the time those pop-ups don't work, and it could be a combination of like antivirus security measures that prevent pop-ups from third-party applications. Everybody's mileage varies. Sometimes it works better on a Mac, and then it doesn't. And it's working better on a Windows machine, and then it isn't. And that's just the nature of the beast. So I tend to be a bit of a purist that way, but I'm going to go to the VirtualBox. I'm going to go to the virtualbox.org website. And I am going to click on the blue link. And I'm going to see that 6.1.36 is the latest build. And because I'm working with Windows, I'm going to use the Windows hosts and click that. So it starts downloading. But if you're a Mac user, please click OS X hosts. And what may happen is that we find out that 6.1.36 has been enhanced to support the new M1 RISC chip for latest, greatest Macs. Again, your mileage may vary. That may not be the case. There are workarounds for the virtual machine appliance build if you can't use VirtualBox. There's one other thing you want to download. It's called the extension pack. You want to make sure that you download the extension pack for all supported platforms. When you download the extension pack for all supported platforms, you load this after you install VirtualBox. When you load the extension pack, it basically says, okay, for your given hardware, the video card works best with this driver. And so it basically fine tunes the mix of hardware components that you have to run the VirtualBox. It's really worth your time to do that. So once again, that's all we're downloading from virtualbox.org. Now, VirtualBox is owned by Oracle. They are champions of the database universe, and they would have you understand that there's only one proper database platform to run on in the universe, and that's Oracle. The founder of Oracle is named Larry Ellison, and Larry Ellison would love to unseat Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk as the richest men in the world because, well, and he's not close. He's not far behind. He purchased an entire Hawaiian island from the end of the Hawaiian island chain a couple of years ago. And he sponsors yachts and regattas and that kind of thing. But basically, Oracle is also the parent company for Java and for MySQL. And so they're a big player. And the other thing that's unique about VirtualBox that I like working with is that VirtualBox is one of the few open source solutions for virtual machine implementation that support as many platforms as they do. So on the Mac, you have Parallels, or you have VMware Fusion. In Windows, you have VMware. And so, but you don't necessarily have you don't have a Linux version, I don't think, of Parallels. And there might be a Linux version of VMware, but it lacks certain things. This supports Unix, Linux, Mac, and Windows, and that's pretty darn cool. And Solaris, by the way, is an original legacy Unix operating system, which predates Linux, predates Windows. And Solaris was purchased by Oracle as well. So basically, Oracle has, you know, operating systems, development environments, the whole 9 yards to compete very nicely. And I mention this because if you're doing a good bit in scientific computing, you're probably going to end up touching or working with one part of Oracle or another. All right, so let's see. Do we need to update our roster? Nope, I think we're good. I think we have 8 still. Yeah. Now, let's start the magic. So if you have a proper VirtualBox download, you should have the following for a file property. Now, if I wanted to take it to an extreme, I could generate a hash of the VirtualBox download and then use this tool to run the hash against my download and compare the two results. But
You mind if we see an example of that?
of the hash?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I'll do that. And that wouldn't take very long, and that'd be pretty cool. Okay. But I'm going to move that to the temp folder. Okay. So I'm going to move both the VirtualBox and the VirtualBox extensions in the temp folder before I run the hash. If I look on screen, you'll actually see a reference to the SHA-256 checksum, which means that if I'm downloading the VirtualBox, I got to make sure I'm referencing the right one. Let me go back. I'm using the Windows host, and the download file that I just plucked was this VirtualBox 6.1.36, probably the 64-bit installer -win.exe, right? And make a note before I forget, of the size. So you should have a download that matches the same size, 111,496,224 bytes. So I'll take this and I'll slide this into the temp folder because I'd like to work in an area or a directory that's not, I don't want to do all my work in the downloads folder. That just gets messy. And I would suggest if you're doing a lot with scientific computing that you don't use your downloads folder as a work area. Does that make sense? Create separate temp folders. Okay, so I have a PGBook OVA. I have I'm going to create 3 series of hashes for each of these. It'll be a part of the recording. You can check this against your work. So I'm going to go ahead and run my hash tool, which is a free app that is supposed to be security cleared. And I'm going to go ahead and run this as an administrator. And I'm going to change this from MD5 to SHA-256. SHA-256 and SHA-512 are hash types for the SHA-2 algorithm. SHA-1 was considered compromised a few years ago. For those of you that are into like cyber and hashing and all that kind of stuff, we'll select the file from our temp folder. That's the other reason why I like to put it in a separate work area, because the temp directory is right off the root of the drive, but my downloads folder, if I'm logged in somewhere else and somebody tries to find it in their downloads folder, they actually have a different downloads folder location and path for their given login. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Kind of, sort of, maybe?
Kind of.
Kind of. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and double click this. And here you see the hash. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open up a notepad. And I'm going to paste this in a notepad. So that's my value after hashing it, hashing the download file. I'm going to go back to my VirtualBox hash. And I'm going to find that listing for exe, and I think it's right here. It's that -win.exe. Everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to copy this with a Control-C, and I'm going to go into my,
Okay, I totally understand it now. So it's just to prove that the file is exactly what it is.
exactly. If there's any change whatsoever during the download process, a single bit, if I change a single 1 or 0 in the entire billion bits, it's going to end up with a different hash, right? But you can see these hashes compare, which means I have a pristine install media, right? And that's important. You want to make sure you don't get any uninvited guests when you're downloading stuff. The drive-by downloads are very common and very devastating. Okay. I'm going to do the same. So what you should end up with is something that ends in 12 Bravo Foxtrot Bravo Charlie, right? And it should match. Okay. Now let's do the same thing for our extension pack, right? So we also have an extension pack. I just got to make sure I'm picking the right extension pack from the list. So I'm going to go into my here, and it's the 36 alpha VBox extension, EXT pack, right? So 36 alpha, it's this one right here, the third one. Everybody see what I'm doing? You know, it's crazy when you can get downloads that just plain barf, because in our neighborhood, there's a lot of power fluctuations and interrupt download disruptions. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that can really muck up your outcomes. I mean, that's just a kind of a pain in the neck. So this is what I have for the extension pack. And let's see what the hash tool will give us when we calculate this. I'll copy this, run to my notepad, and then paste. Oh yeah. So it should end in D2 Charlie Alpha 75, right? So that's the hash if you get a correct download for the extension pack. Does anyone want to see the hash for the 10 gigabyte download? I want you to notice the hash length is the same, whether it's a couple of hundred megs for the download or it's just a couple of kilobytes for the download. That's one thing about a mathematical algorithm that generates hashes that's so special, right? So
How
let's
does
just,
hash, so what does hash have to do with crypto then? Because every what's it called? Bitcoin has like a certain hash.
yes. Well, a hash is a way to validate whether something is authentic or not, or whether it's been modified or not. So let's say that you have an original digital file that you want to give to somebody and you want them to rest assured that it is what they're looking at is actually the real McCoy. So you generate a hash and you send that to them separately, or even a part of the same message. You say, here, and then you're using the right kind of cryptographic instrument to generate the hashes, right? Now, in my case, I'm using an open source tool to use SHA-256, and that's a specific hashing algorithm. But you can also use other keys, encryption keys, to generate hashes, depending on the design of the cryptographic method. And essentially what happens is that the other person on the other end has the ability to use the same key to test what they're looking at. And if the hashes don't match, it means that an imposter has sent them that digital file, or it means that the digital file has been modified somehow or become corrupted in transit. So in terms of cybersecurity, one of the foundational concepts of cybersecurity is this idea of integrity. Confidentiality or secrecy is one aspect, but integrity is the other. Are you getting the authentic thing? Now, how is this relevant in scientific computing, in the context of scientific computing? Many times when something isn't working, it's because of simple errors early in the process. What you've watched me do takes a few extra minutes, but when somebody says, yeah, maybe you got a bad download, you can say, no, I checked the hash. I got a good download. I know it's not the download. It helps you save a lot of time when you're troubleshooting a scientific computing challenge. It's not, things aren't working right, your results are different, there's an error there somewhere and you can't pin it down. You want to be able to eliminate other possibilities very quickly. If I select a file like the actual OVA, I'm going to create a problem because it's going to take a while. I'll have the same value in terms of length for the hash, but it's going to chew on it for a good bit. And I'm on an Intel i5 processor on a Lenovo laptop with 12 gigs of RAM. That's not going to generate a hash as quickly as I'd like. If we were in a cyber class and I had 10 minutes to spare, I'd do it. I will generate this hash after class and post the result so that you can verify that your extracted OVA file is correct, okay? Now, here's one of the most important things we want to do next. Any questions about the hashing tool? Hash tool 1.2. You can get it from the Microsoft Store, right? Or downloads. So this is part of what you're doing for your solution for module 1. And I'm thinking the credit I posted last season for that was too small. Anyway, I'm going to install this now, and I'm going to use my temp folder, my workspace, to do this. So I'm first going to right-click and run as administrator. And I'm going to accept all the defaults. Little pop-up says, are you sure you want to do this? And I'll say yes. You didn't see that on the screen, but I did. It says, welcome to the Oracle VM 6.1.36 setup. I'm going to accept the defaults and just click next, 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 and yes. For just a moment, what's going to happen is that the network interface may hiccup because it's creating a virtual networking component that is going to sponge off of my physical wireless adapter. And as it does this, we might lose connectivity in our Zoom session for just a moment. So if we break the Zoom session, please stand by. I'm going to start the Oracle VirtualBox 6.1.36 after installation. Yep. And it's going to open up. And you'll see it says you have an older version of the pack. Do you wish to download? I'm going to cancel this because I'm going to load it separately. I have some old versions of old things from last semester, and I'm going to remove these because I don't need them anymore. Okay. That's some leftovers from last season when I was doing this. I'll go ahead and close this. I just wanted to make sure it would start up all right. But now I'm going to double click. Now that I've installed VirtualBox, now you see this actually has a custom icon. Before, it didn't have a cutesy little icon. I'm going to double click this to load this. And it's going to say, hey, do you want to do this to upgrade to 6.1.36? Yeah, I do, because I want everything to match. I'm going to scroll down so that I agree to the policies that make Larry Ellison even richer, and I'm going to say yes. And it's going to install the extension pack, and this is what I want to see. If you don't see this, you have a problem. If it doesn't say the extension pack was installed successfully, this is an issue, okay? Any questions? Now we're ready for the cool part. I want to create a separate work folder for my virtual machines as well. I don't want to unpack everything in my temp folder. I use my temp folder for all sorts of work, all sorts of things. But I'm going to take this and I'm going to unpack it and let it expand into a huge virtual machine. So I'm going to create a separate VM folder. You'll notice that right now the VM folder is empty. If I had additional hard disks to expand to, I would use those. But for now, that's what I'm going to do. Is everybody with me? In my VirtualBox Manager, I'm going to go to the File Preferences, and I'm going to change the preferences so that what originally posted here for downloads or documents, the default machine folder does not point to my VM directory. You would have to do this and select Other, and then navigate to the VM folder of your C drive. Otherwise, it's going to put your virtual machine in the Documents folder. Now, if you happen to have Office 365 integrated so that your documents are stored in OneDrive, watch out. It's going to try to unpack a 20 gigabyte virtual machine and put it where? In your online cloud storage in OneDrive. It is painful. Please. I want everybody to stop what you're doing, tune up your microphone, unmute it, and say, yes, I'm listening.
Yes, I'm listening.
I won't put it in my doc. I won't accept the default location for my VirtualBox VM location, right? Okay, Courtney's good. How about the rest of you? Come on, let's hear you.
Yes, yes, I'm listening.
I am not going to.
Well, I already have my virtual box set up. I
Yeah.
have the thing. I probably have to update it.
Yes. How about you, Desi?
Yeah. So a question, sorry. But do you want us to, is there a certain OS you want us to run on this, or is there like multiple?
That's a great question. The whole
Oh yeah,
machine,
but my VirtualBox folders have already been set up in documents along with all my other old stuff that we're using.
right. Well, you want to create a VM directory and then point to the VM directory. So when you're done, it looks like this. And to answer the question that was just asked about the operating system, the virtual machine runs a Linux distribution. It runs a version of Linux and it's already pre-configured. So it's ready to go. Yeah. And the fun part is if you don't buy the textbook, you don't get the login and password. Yeah. So I'm going to know whether or not you bought the textbook because in order to finish the solution, you have to log in and use the password and then show me the login screen. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and I've chosen the VM folder. So now it reads C:\VM. In a Mac, it's going to read VM. You should create a separate folder in your Finder called VM, and you should find it and point to it if you have a Mac. Does everybody understand what I'm talking about for the Mac?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when I'm ready to get started with the appliance, you import an appliance. So when you hold your pointer over import, you see that it adds the word appliance, and OVA is an appliance. So I'm going to look for something out of the local file system. I'll click this folder and I'll go to where? Where did I store that thing? Oh, my temp folder. Right. There it is. So the file is here, but it's going to create the VM in my VM folder. Now, once it's finished doing that, I can delete this OVA or move it to another disk so I can get some space back. If I use expert mode, it's going to ask me to do some stuff, right? I'll go back to guided mode, but this is the point that I want to call out to you. It says include only NAT network adapter MAC addresses. We're going to make a change there in guided mode, or in that mode, you're going to select something different for that particular option. I'm going to hit next. And this is the screen that comes up whether you're in guided or other. Everybody see this option right here?
Yeah.
I want you to generate a new MAC address for all network adapters. Now, in the past, we couldn't get this to work right unless you made that change. And then when they came out with a new version, it didn't happen that way anymore. It'll be interesting to see what happens here. I want you to know that so the question was asked, are we setting up something for an operating system like a Linux? And to answer the question specifically, Ubuntu 16.04 long-term support, LTS it's called, that's what's used for this setup. And it's going to pre-configure a CPU with 1 core and with 2 gigs of RAM. It doesn't say how much disk space, and this is the part that gets me a little leery, right? This is the one part that I don't like. Again, I want you to select generate a new MAC address for all network adapters. What that does is it means that your specific MAC address is going to be different and unique like it's supposed to be. And if this doesn't work, then I'll delete the stupid thing, go back and leave it at the default where it said include only NAT network, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So what does this mean as it's building your virtual appliance? It means your virtual appliance is going to become a virtual machine and it's going to appear on your home network as if it were a different computer system. And what you'll see is PGBook out on your home network. Does everybody understand what I'm telling you? It won't be embedded inside your laptop, so it's hiding behind your laptop's NIC. It's going to be its own virtual machine capable of doing its own computing work. So I'm going to hit import. And hopefully, God willing, within a couple of minutes, and this is with a very heavily multitasked Lenovo, 10-year-old Lenovo with a solid state hard drive with 12 gigs of RAM and 30 extra gigs of hard disk space and an i5 processor. It's importing this disk image, and it's going to take 3 minutes to complete the work. Let's take a look at what's happening under the hood. Oh, look at that go. Yeah, okay. So as I'm unpacking and building the virtual machine, of course, it's loading the memory and the CPU levels a lot higher. Those are important things to consider. And after it's built, I can tweak some settings. I can use more of the cores. I can add more memory. I can make this thing sit up and bark and run a lot faster just by changing the amount of RAM. Because I have 12 gigs of RAM, I can use 4 or 8 gigs of RAM if I'm not running anything else. Because I have 4 logical processors in my physical laptop, I can use more than one CPU for this appliance after it's built, after it's running, okay? Now you can't make some of those hardware changes while it's running, but that's worth mentioning. What will happen is that the network adapter will generate a new MAC address, and it will manifest itself through the Wi-Fi adapter that's active. Now, most laptops also have a hardwired Ethernet port. And there are times where a virtual machine won't work right and it won't get out on the internet because it's pinned to the Ethernet port on your laptop. And there's a simple place inside the VirtualBox Manager where you can change the configuration to point to the Wi-Fi adapter that actually provides your internet access. So once again, if you have problems connecting to the internet or doing simple things with your VirtualBox PGBook appliance, you know, we're going to be doing scientific computing activities that require network access. And if that isn't happening, it's because you need to change a setting in the machine settings so it points to the Wi-Fi instead of Ethernet. Unless, of course, you use an Ethernet cable connected straight to your internet service provider's router. Are there any questions? Okay, so while that's running, what I'd like to do is relate the expectation that when you purchase your textbook, in the appendix, it's going to have the login password you need to work that virtual machine. And you should be reading chapter 1 and then sections 2.1 through 2.3 of chapter 2 and section 3.1 of chapter 3. You want to memorize anything from the content below, right? So let's talk about the content below. We've already talked about the basic components of hardware last week. Did we not talk about the von Neumann model computing? I showed you a picture of the von Neumann computing model, yes? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So what are the primary hardware components in every computer in existence? Well, you're going to have this. You're going to have 3 zones. You'll have a CPU or a processor, right? You're going to have memory or RAM, and you're going to have input-output devices like keyboard and mouse, display, video cards, sensors, network adapters, that kind of thing. That's all input-output. Let's get on to something more interesting. Okay. So essentially, this is worth some time. I'd really like it if you could watch these 2 YouTubes. one of the things that's important to understand is this idea that we did tell you last week that one of the important things to do with any computing environment is to think about what you want in terms of expected outputs, yes? Start from the end and work back to the beginning. Does that ring a bell? Please say yes. There was something like that last week, I think. You ask yourself, what kind of report, what kind of data do you want from the analysis? And you work backwards from there. Does that? Okay. It's important to frame the data management for a computing challenge with a view of the expected outputs. In turn, this requires certain calculations. We're working backwards. If you're looking at certain calculations, that means you have to have certain equations, and that requires certain inputs. So you have to process the data. You have to have data inputs. It has to be passed through certain equations, calculations, in order to get to the outputs. Essentially, too many people, and I can't overemphasize this enough, too many people in a very basic computing scenario don't know where to start. And it's easy. You start with the end in mind. You start with the outputs, and then you think about, okay, how am I going to process that data? That involves the calculations needed to produce the outputs. Once you know what outputs you need, then you can work backwards and say, okay, if I have this kind of output, I know I'm going to have to use this kind of calculation. If I'm using a Monte Carlo simulation, I'm going to be working with Monte Carlo equations, right? It's not rocket science, okay? Then we work backwards and figure out, okay, what kind of inputs are expected in order for a Monte Carlo simulation to work. And this whole idea of inputs, process, and outputs may seem like it's oversimplified, and it seems very basic stuff. And everybody just sort of spitballs. They just spitball. I want to take a moment to pause. So while this thing is running in the background, has anybody ever like submitted a math exam and then you get it back and it's scored and you didn't get full credit because you made a mistake on the solution for the math problem? And there was a comment written that said something like, I don't know, show your work. You get incomplete credit for an answer you turned in for a math problem because, well, you have the answer, but you didn't write out the work. You didn't show how you reached that result. Has anybody ever experienced something like that before?
A few times, but nowadays people just seem more interested in at least the answers.
That's an excellent observation, Courtney. Nowadays, people are just more interested in, yeah, you get on with it, just spit out the answer, right? And this is an IPO table, is a simple though elegant and effective way to organize the essentials. And it's going to seem like, oh, come on, this is a waste of time. But I want you to spend some time walking through the examples that we share with some of the sample IPO table documents. Okay? There's another piece of this too, and it has to do with variable names. On Thursday, we're going to do some gymnastics when it comes to how to name your data elements. Your input data elements, your output data elements, and how that'll make or break your computing environment, okay? How many of you are fans of algebra where you learned to use single letter variables like x plus y equals z? Anybody? Right? Yeah, just to get the simple basics of a math operation. Who wants to waste a lot of time trying to figure out how to name your variables? So in math, we use single letter variable names. In scientific computing, we do not. I will vomit all over your submission. If you submit some code for a solution and I see I equals whatever, A equals whatever, I'm going to say, what is this? There's a lot of things that carry over from mathematics into computing, but one of the things we have to lose is the idea that we're only working with abstractions that are math-based. We are working with a language. When we're doing programming and we're creating custom programming applications, we want to use the language part of our brain. That doesn't mean we're going to get into grammar and stuff, but we want to be more descriptive. For example, and this is one of the examples I'm going to say, I could say I have a variable and I'm going to store a string of character that reads, it's going to be a welcome prompt. When somebody first clicks into an application, they're going to see on the screen a prompt that says, welcome to Carnival. Press enter to begin your registration, right? Press enter to begin your registration. So it's a greeting and a prompt. And the simple truth is, I can write code that stores that whole string of letters in a sentence in a single variable named A. And then I can have a next task, and it stores the output or input into a variable called B. And then the next one, a variable called C. But the problem is that when I get errors, when I try to run that, I get indecipherable error statements. If I get something instead that says, hey, wrong data type for string first user prompt, I'm going to go, wait a minute now. The data type in my variable here is supposed to be string. That means it's alphanumeric characters, it's letters. I'm not storing numbers in there, I'm storing letters of the alphabet. That's what string means. That's the data type I'm supposed to use. If it says wrong data type, oh, wait a minute, I'm putting numbers in something that's supposed to receive letters. If I have a descriptive name like first user prompt, right, then I know what its purpose is. What does this string do? It's the first user prompt of my application. That's what I choose to name my output variable. Why do I call it an output variable? Because I'm outputting a greeting to the display screen. This is an output variable. Now that's just one quick example of what I'm talking about. We're going to get into the cool part of this with Python, and you're going to be doing some crazy gymnastics on Thursday. But with the time remaining, what we want to do is make sure this is working. So what's happened, let's get back to our any questions about what I just shared about inputs, outputs, processing, a table called an IPO table. I means input, P means process, O means output. IPO table, right? Take some time to review that. Click on those links. Everybody's heard of this, garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, you get garbage if you don't take the time to consider what I just shared with you. Okay. And again, more of that on Thursday. If we've imported our virtual machine for our solution, what we should have is a virtual machine that uses 2 gigs of RAM. It uses a certain amount of display memory. And what I can do is start to run it. I'm going to change some settings. There was a question? Was there a question? Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
So I go into settings and I notice right away that the appliance for my machine, it doesn't like the virtual implementation of my graphics display for the virtual machine. It does not like VBox VGA, the default. It's telling me, hey, consider switching, right? The other thing too is that I don't use very much for video memory. So I'm going to increase the video memory. I'm going to max it out because I want to have all sorts of really cool graphics in my virtual machine. I'm also going to change this to VMS VGA. And now
Wait, what does that stand for?
it stands for virtual machines is SVGA. So SVGA is a higher resolution. So VGA is a very basic video graphics array. It's a very basic resolution, 640 by 480. SVGA is higher resolution. I think it's 1024 by 768. When I change this to VM SVGA, I'm saying instead of the VBox VGA, that's incompatible. This is a very low level, low resolution, like almost painful to look at. Says your virtual machine is configured to use this and the graphics controller on your machine doesn't like it. So if you see something like this, hold your pointer over it, read what it says, and then make the recommended change. And it should go away, okay? Thank you for asking that question. Now, if I have 3D acceleration capabilities built into my physical graphics processor on the laptop, I can enable this just to see if that works. But what I'd recommend is that you make just the minimum changes that you have to in order for this thing to start. I want to check my network setting and I want to make sure that it's a bridged adapter and it's set for my wireless and I should be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and then I'm going to hit start. And in this case, I'm going to use the pull down and select detachable start, which means because I have a laptop, if it goes into power save mode, I won't kill the VM. You'll see the thing swirl. It'll say creating the process for the virtual machine, starting the virtual machine. Oh, and did I fail to mention? I should probably check my drive space just to see what happened after it unpacked. Oh, I went from 35 to 15 gigs, about 20 gigs, right? Once again, if my virtual machine is running properly, I can delete or move the OVA file in case I have to reload it. I would advise you move it to a thumb drive or an external drive. Okay. Now, some of you have other classes starting at 4:30. I don't want to run long. I want to be sensitive to that. We started a few minutes later than kickoff because it's the second week. We're going to try to close sooner. Here's what I need. Ladies and gentlemen, feast your eyes on a fully functional scientific computing application platform crafted by your publisher. Ready-made PGBook. Those are the initials of the two authors, right? So the password is in the appendix of the textbook. You put that in, the screen that comes up, you open up a terminal and type in something, you capture the screen, and that's what you submit for your solution. Are there any questions about how to walk through your first solution?
So I told you I had a actual Raspberry Pi. Do you mind if I do it off there, or do I have to actually do it off VirtualBox?
I do not mind at all if you do everything with your Raspberry Pi. You may have to run a couple of scripts or load some applications in order to do the things that we perform in our class. But the odds are pretty good. It's going to be pre-configured and built in anyway. Raspberry Pi is really amazing for how complete it is for what you're spending. So what you're going to want to do on your Raspberry Pi is create a user called PGBook, just like the one seen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you wanted me to run it off Ubuntu, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, so the Raspbian OS is it's an incarnation of that. You could use that, but create an account and sign in with PGBook and make sure the password is the same as what's in the appendix. And then when we're running certain things, like you might have to load a library for your Python, but I don't think so, because I think the math library is included in the Python that's loaded in a Raspberry Pi. So great question. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned. Please complete as much as you can of your reading and the assignments. And to the extent that you can finish your personal technology optimization, go ahead and get your download started with Dropbox using the link. I'll have that posted as soon as we close. I'll also post this video as soon as we're done. And then we'll take up some things on Thursday. So we're off to the races.